But as long as the Fed is there, the politician is going to spend money, because that's how the politician gets reelected. What do you need? Oh, well, I need more of this, this, and this. And the politician continues to spend, and they don't worry about the deficit. Also, it facilitates our foreign policy. What if we would have had to pay literally for our foreign policy and all the interventionism that's been going on? It would have ended, because it couldn't have been sustained. The people would have rebelled because the taxes would be so high and interest rates would go up. So in other words, with the Federal Reserve, it allows the growth of government. And to the point where as the government grows, it diminishes our personal liberty. And as we do that, we undermine productivity, and the country has to get poorer. So now we face this horrendous crisis. We have a foreign policy that's totally out of control. We have a welfare state totally out of control. We have 60, 70, 80 trillion dollars of entitlement obligations. We have a national debt of $14 trillion. And the politicians in Washington, you'd think they would wake up. But the other day we had 2 votes on the House floor. Annoyed me to no end on the outcome of this. One had to do, conservative Republican leadership thought, well, you know, the NPR, those national, the government radio, they said some nasty things. We need to punish them. But, you know, they get a few $1 million here and there. I think it's $10 million, which is unconstitutional. I always vote against that, and I'm not defending it. But think in comparison of NPR and what they're getting, and then the same day we had a vote, when a coalition of Democrats and Republicans came together and said, this is a resolution, if you vote for this, we're telling the president he ought to be out of Afghanistan by the end of this year. So we had a total of 93 votes to come home and quit pursuing a policy that was similar to the one that brought the Soviet system down. So overwhelmingly, and especially those conservative Republicans who are ready to balance the budget, supported continuing this policy, which just in Afghanistan costs us $130 billion a year. But no, then overwhelmingly they voted to delete the funds for NPR and be able to go home and say, hey, look at what we did. We're going to balance the budget on the backs of NPR. It just struck me as totally inconsistent and not addressing the subject. That's because it's still political down there. And you have to think in bigger terms. You have to think about our policies. To deal with, and even Afghanistan, coming out of Afghanistan only addresses a small amount of that problem. It's the overall policy. It's the policy of interventionism. It's this policy that the founders advised us against. The founders said, no entangling alliances, don't get involved in internal affairs of other nations. Be friends with nations, trade with people, but stay out of these foreign entanglements. And of course, they were really pretty strict on the idea of militarism. They actually had this belief that you shouldn't even have a standing army. I mean, that's how radical they were. But even under today's circumstances, you can have an army, but you can have a better foreign policy, and it should be the policy of the founders, the policy of the Constitution. We have no constitutional authority to go over and remake Afghanistan, take over the oil of Iraq, continue the bombing of Pakistan. They're worried about some civilians being killed in Libya. Well, that is terrible. And now we're there for humanitarian reasons, but I don't believe that for a minute. We're in Iraq. They happen to have oil. We control the government of Saudi Arabia. They happen to have a little bit of oil. Libya happens to have a little bit of oil. In the last 5 years, the West has been investing in Libya. But Rwanda didn't have any oil. Did we stop? We were there for humanitarian reasons. But a policy of non-intervention would keep our troops at home, and we would have a lot more peace. We would spend a lot less money. Our our whole system wouldn't be threatened. Randolph Bourne had the best summary of what war is. He says, war is the health of the state. So if you love your liberty and you don't like the state, you have to be very, very cautious about ever going to war. The founders were very clear. The decision to go to war was not to be the president. It was to be the Congress. It was to be the House and the Senate, because they're closer to the people, and the executive branch was not to declare the war. But today, how do we go to war? It's under executive directions, even the ones that ever since World War II. We have not had one declaration of war. We've had just police actions, you know, and it's on and on. I was in the service in the 60s. During Vietnam. I did not go to Vietnam. I was in for a total 5 years as a flight surgeon. But at that time, I had not thought these things through. A lot of people at 18 and 20 and 21, you know, were trying to get through school and get a job. I'm impressed that the young people today have thought a lot more about politics, and I can predict everybody in this room have thought a lot more about politics at your age than I did when I was your age, which I think is very encouraging. But if we change the policy, it would change everything. We would have our troops, so we wouldn't have troops in 130 countries. We have like 780 bases around the world. And then we say that we're not an imperialistic nation, that we are only there to take care of the people who need humanitarian help. And all of a sudden, you know, people now, I think, are starting to wake up. There's more question, thankfully, about Libya than there has been in a long time, and I hope the American people keep the pressure on Washington so that we don't go and look for another war. We don't need another war in Libya. But you know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, before this whole thing broke out, but we knew that Gaddafi was being demonstrated against, I introduced a resolution. It was a sense of Congress resolution to try to call attention to this. The resolution simply said, if they would have brought it to the floor, it simply said that the President, Mr. President, you don't need to impose a no-flight zone over Libya without coming to the Congress to get the permission. That's all it said. Of course, nobody paid any attention to that. And did he take my advice? No, but I wasn't all that surprised that he didn't take my advice either. But he did get his authority. He went to the United Nations to get his authority. The United Nations said it was okay. Now there'd be one little piece of legislation, if I could get it passed, and maybe someday it will, we wouldn't have to worry about that, and that would be just to get us out of the United Nations. Rather quickly after the United Nations was formed, I mean, Truman took us to war. It was under a UN resolution, and that war hasn't even ended. We still have our troops in Korea. I think it's time we come home from Korea. And while we're at it, we might as well bring them home from Japan and Germany, along with bringing them home from the Middle East. The troops will come home, but it's going to be under different circumstances because I'm not going to win this debate, and I understand this. But we'll win this argument if you support this position because we're going to run out of money, and that's going to be very, very dangerous because under those circumstances, we don't know exactly what kind of government we will have, and that will be the challenge. But we need to change our attitudes. We need to change our attitudes about the welfare state. We need to change our attitude about the warfare state. And we need to change our attitude about allowing our federal government to undermine our personal liberties and our personal lives. There's been a healthy move on for the reviving of the issue of nullification. I consider that very healthy. We should be states have a right to nullify unconstitutional laws passed by the federal government. We could start, and one thing that has brought this to our attention has been the Obamacare. So we could start by nullifying Obamacare. This is becoming more appropriate and people are thinking this way is because for so long everybody thought, well, the federal government's going to take care of me from cradle to grave and it will never be a problem. But they're starting to realize it's not that way anymore. We don't know how long all the gravy is going to last. So they're much more cautious about it and they don't trust it. And now they're challenging it. But we should have a system where the states have more to say. It was intended that individuals had sovereignty, local communities did, and to most of the states. But the federal government was not meant to run the lives of the states and run the states or run the lives of us as individuals. So, how we ever got involved in allowing the government to decide what we should eat and drink and smoke and everything else. I don't know how that happened, but it's about time the American people should say that our personal activities should be treated like we treat our First Amendment. We legalize, and generally we understand the legalization of the First Amendment says that you can speak out on issues, and the purpose of the amendment is to protect controversial speech. So true liberty means that the federal government should protect controversial personal activity as long as you don't hurt people, and the government should stay out of our lives. If that were the case, just think, the federal government couldn't have any regulations on drinking raw milk. And also it would mean that the people of this country could grow this very, very dangerous product called hemp. People could we get people to pay attention. We're not even talking about marijuana. All we're talking about is commercial hemp to make rope, and it's illegal in this country. And not only that is they worry about these programs for energy. Oh, we got to be energy independent. So we can't build nuclear power plants, and we can't do this, and we got to send troops to protect our oil, and we're going to subsidize ethanol and raise corn and push up prices and do all these things. And then it never dawns on them that there's probably more ethanol in hemp than there is in corn, and they make it illegal. So, well, there is some good news, and the good news is that the country's waking up and there will be a change and we're going to have an opportunity. The bad news is it's still a mess in Washington. The Tea Party movement has been helpful, but there's no true revolution in Washington. But I sense there's a true revolution going on in grassroots America. We have to have a better understanding and more confidence in ourselves and in the principles of liberty. That's one thing I believe the founders understood. They did not set up a welfare state. They did not set up a funny money system. They believed that only gold and silver were legal tender. They didn't encourage it, as they discouraged it, and didn't give us the authority to police the world. And we virtually have lost that. We have good traditions. We have good traditions about property ownership. But do we really follow them? I mean, we don't have property ownership. You know, not too long ago, I went to build a house in a little town in Lake Jackson, Texas, and you'd be surprised. No, I don't think you'd be surprised. I had to check with the federal government for about 15 regulations on how high the house should be and what kind of lumber I was going to use and everything else. So we are regulated to death, and we're taxed to death, and then they say we own the property, but we only own the property because we have to be liable for the mistakes they make. So, the principle of private property ownership really could, if you fold that through, you don't need a whole lot else. If you really protected private property, it would protect your First Amendments. And just think, you know, owning a gun is a piece of property. You should be protected in owning a gun, you know. believed in private property ownership, but they really believed in the ownership of guns. That's why they stuck that Second Amendment in there to make sure we understood. So we are at a point now where financially we're in trouble. We don't know what's going to happen. The dollar is in trouble. It's going to get in worse trouble. And I think something internationally is going on. I think there's a coming together. I think there's one of the reasons why you're seeing so many revolts in the Middle East is not only are they sick and tired of their dictatorships and our puppet governments over there, which they've been for a long time, but I think what they're sensing that we may be a financial paper tiger, maybe even militarily. Yes, in a conventional war, we have more weapons and we spend more money than everybody else put together, and nobody's ever going to attack us, which should make us more secure rather than insecure. But I think people are thinking there's a limit to what the United States can do. You know, how many more troops can they call up? They have troops, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're worried about some people killed in Libya, and we should, be not very sympathetic to that. But in the last couple of years, we killed over 2,000 civilians in Pakistan with our drone missiles. And what are we doing? And, they see the inconsistency. Some Americans see the inconsistency, but we've been taught that if you say anything about policy, oh, that means you're un-American. You're not supporting the troops. You're not a patriotic person. Well, I think being patriotic is challenging your government when it's wrong and not going along with it. The people around the world are feeling their oats and they understand what kind of problem we have. I think the Chinese are aware of it. The Chinese sell weapons as well, but they, those are terrible people over there. They actually make stuff and sell it to us, make profits, and they save the money. And then they go and they invest their money. Yes, they're around the world buying up stuff almost like a capitalist. But what are we doing? We're going and saying, look, we have investments made in Libya and we have to protect those investments. That's what's been going on. But I believe it's coming to an end. And it's coming to an end, and they understand our financial conditions and our inability to continue to police the world. It's less popular. There will be too many fires in the world. So we live in truly revolutionary times, but it gives us a tremendous opportunity. Because we have the traditions, we have the beliefs, we have the understanding of private property and contract laws and sound money. The Soviet system and the Russians didn't have that, and they had more turmoil. So we don't have to remake America. All we have to do is restore America and understand the people's values. So we cannot operate in Washington or any place by perpetuating the conventional wisdom of welfarism and transfer of payments and taking care of the special interests, taking care of the military-industrial complex and the banking-industrial complex and the medical-industrial complex. It's a corporatism run wild. The real tragedy here is that corporatism, which is nothing more than special favors and a combination of government and big business, that freedom is challenged. They say, oh, that's capitalism and that's freedom. That's what free markets do to us, which is untrue. Free markets don't do this. It's the privileges given to a few. It's nothing. You can't argue that bailing out General Motors and the banks, that's not free market capitalism. That's crony capitalism at its worst. So my challenge is we all should continue to study and understand and how to defend ourselves. That liberty has the moral high ground, and those who have argued that as long as we give goods and services and transfer wealth from one group to another and take care of those who seem to be in need, we have to change that. We have to show that if you want a moral high ground and care about humanitarianism, you vouch for liberty and you vouch for sound money. Argue with you that we're cold-hearted and say that we don't care about the poor. You say, yes, you cared about the poor and you wanted to give the poor a house. So you had low interest rates, funny money going on, and you subsidize housing. Guess what? The Depression came, people lost their jobs, and guess who lost their houses? Did the Wall Streeters lose their houses? No, the poor people lost their houses and they lost their mortgages. So the only humanitarian system available to us, the only way you can have productive wealth and a fair distribution, the fairest distribution possible, is through a free market system. And that is keying in on one thing, and that is the protection of individual liberty. That will do it. The case for liberty, which is the argument that our founders made in a unique manner, provides us the opportunity as individuals to be responsible for working for our excellence and virtue. That should be a personal goal. When government takes over the role of telling you what you have to do to be virtuous and to have a fair income, and then government can only do that at taking away your liberty. That has to be a personal responsibility. It's imperfect. But just think, it's a lot better than depending on a government that is totally inept and becoming more inept every single day. Personal liberty is a human right. It comes from us in a natural way or a God-given way. It isn't something that the government ever provided for us. The little bit that they should be involved in is protecting that, and maybe being the referee when violence breaks out, and the prevention of violence, but not to try to mold people or mold the economy and tell you how you live and what you do. If you mess up, though, and mess up your life when you have your freedom, it's your responsibility. You can't go crawling to the government and say, take care of it. I want to close this little message. I want to indicate to you that though I am reluctant to travel, I don't like getting on airplanes, but I never resist an invitation to come and talk to young people because I know there's a lot of energy there and here. The energy is that you've recognized that foreign policy intervention is not in your best interest. You recognize that just printing money doesn't make any sense. And you recognize that the welfare state doesn't make us healthier. But the young people that I have met, and they're younger than this crowd, they're high school kids and people that I couldn't ever dream would be interested in some of the things we're talking about, interested in the Constitution and the Federal Reserve. So it's very encouraging to me to see the rumblings going on. And just remember when you're discouraged and say, well, we're only a couple percent, we're 3, 5, 10% of the people who care. Believe me, being in a leadership position and talking this and people wanting to listen to what you say, that makes the difference. So philosophically, things are changing. 10 years ago, we would have never been able to get support at looking at the Federal Reserve like we're getting right now. Things are changing. The educational activity is changing. The internet is tremendously helpful to us. So let's take this energy and make sure it's keyed in on the issue of personal liberty, understand it, and convince other people it is in their best interest to support. Thank you very much.